Machines roared like beasts, and men screamed like machines, their cries sharp through the dampened filters of my helmet. The air on Nereth 6 had always been this way, clogged with ash and smoke so thick it became its own kind of weather, choking out the sun and leaving us to fight under a dull copper sky. I adjusted the Spiritus Codex, a cumbersome piece of equipment mounted to my forearm. It glowed softly, its segmented screen displaying readouts I knew better than my own pulse. Lines of sacred code scrolled down its surface, guiding me as I prepared for the binding. I worked with the precision of someone who had done this too many times before, my gloves slick with blood that wasn't mine. The smell clung to me, a mixture of burnt oil and something sour that I told myself wasn't fear. To my right stood the Titan I served, Corpus Exultis, the bone engine. Its skeletal frame towered over the battlefield, a grotesque amalgamation of metal and organic material. Its form shifted constantly as it moved, a maze of exposed cables and sinew stretching taut over its massive limbs. Where its face should have been was a cavernous void, ringed by glowing runes. It wasn't silent, none of them were. Beneath the screech of machinery and the deep groans of strained metal, I could hear the voices of the bound. I adjusted my neural uplink, the small cluster of ports embedded along my spine burning as they synced with the codex. The uplink was supposed to make the process easier, allowing me to feel the souls more clearly, to guide them with precision into the God Engine's core. But every time I connected, it felt like someone was taking a hammer to my skull. The Imperium called this pain a blessing, a reminder that I was serving a purpose greater than myself. They didn't know what it was like to hear the dead. The Spiritus Codex let out a faint chime, signaling readiness. Around me, soldiers huddled in the trenches, their faces hidden behind visors smeared with mud and blood. They whispered prayers to the God Engines, their hands clasped tightly around relics that would never save them. These men and women worshipped Corpus Exultis as a god, a savior that would deliver them victory. But to me, it was just a machine that demanded sacrifices I was obligated to make. "Binder Istrin," the commander's voice transmitted through my comlink. "The engine is ready. Begin the binding sequence." The soldiers around me parted, leaving a wide berth as I approached. Lying before me were the dead, lined up in neat rows like offerings. The bodies were fresh, their wounds still steaming in the cold air. Most were Imperium soldiers, their faces serene despite the violence that had taken them. Others were enemy combatants, stripped of their armor but left intact enough to be usable. Death didn't discriminate here, and neither could I. I knelt by the first body, a young man whose helmet had been split clean in half, the edges of the wound charred from plasma fire. His empty eyes stared past me, unblinking, as I placed the codex against his chest. The device hissed, and a thin needle slid into his flesh, siphoning the glow of his essence. The soul resisted at first, it always did, but the codex was persistent, pulling the energy free like thread unraveling from a spool. I murmured the binding chant under my breath. "Your sacrifice fuels the Imperium. Your soul ascends with the God Engine. Eternal honor awaits you." The glow traveled up the needle, threading into the codex's core where it would be funneled directly into Corpus Exultis. The God Engine shuddered as the soul joined its collective, a ripple passing through its massive frame. I could feel the difference immediately, a tug at the edge of my mind like a stranger brushing against my thoughts. One down, too many to count. I moved to the next body, then the next. Each binding felt like a splinter driving deeper into my skull, but I forced myself to stay focused. If I faltered, even for a moment, the souls could scatter, lost to the void. That was what they told us in training. The truth was worse. When a soul wasn't properly bound, it didn't vanish. It lingered, half-formed and screaming, clinging to whatever scraps of consciousness it could find. I had learned that the hard way on my first deployment. As I worked, the battlefield around me raged on. Artillery thundered in the distance, shaking the ground beneath my boots. I caught glimpses of enemy machines, massive, spindly constructs that moved with an unsettling fluidity. They weren't like our god engines. Where ours were monuments to the Imperium's faith, theirs were abominations, built without reverence or order. One of them advanced rapidly, firing a burst of searing energy that cut through the ranks of Imperium soldiers like a knife through cloth. I didn't flinch. My work wasn't on the front lines. It was here, in the quiet horror of the binding. I reached the final body, a woman who couldn't have been much older than me. Her features were sharp, her jaw set in a way that made her look defiant even in death. A deep wound split her torso, but her face was untouched, framed by strands of dark hair matted with blood. I didn't know her, but there was something about her stillness that made my hands falter. The codex buzzed impatiently, its needle hovering just above her chest. I steeled myself to press it down, muttering the chant as her soul was drawn into the device. Her eyes didn't close. They never did. When the final soul joined the god engine, Corpus Exultis let out a deep groan, its frame trembling as the energy surged through it. My neural link flared, a jolt of pain ripping through my spine. I clenched my teeth, gripping the codex tightly as the sensation passed. I deactivated the codex and stepped back, my breathing shallow. "Binding complete," I said into the comm link. "Good work, Binder Istrin," the commander replied. "Return to the trench. We'll need you again soon." I turned to face the god engine, its empty face staring down at me. I thought I saw something within the void, a glimmer of light or maybe a shadow. It was impossible to tell. The voices in my head began to subside, fading into the background like a chorus retreating from the stage. But one voice remained, speaking just above a whisper. "Elisar." The name hit me like a blow to the chest. It wasn't possible. The souls didn't know me. They couldn't. But the voice was unmistakable, soft, familiar, and laced with a pain that cut deeper than any weapon. The battlefield erupted in chaos. One of the enemy machines had broken through the lines, its spindly limbs tearing into the trenches. Soldiers screamed as its plasma cannons fired indiscriminately, the blast searing the ground and filling the air with the stench of burning flesh. The Imperium's forces scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The machine was already upon us. "Corpus Exultis," the commander instructed, "engage the enemy." The god engine roared to life, its massive limbs unfolding. It moved with terrifying speed, its skeletal form tearing through the battlefield toward the enemy construct. I felt its movements in my mind, each step resonating like a drumbeat against my thoughts. The bound souls screamed, their agony spilling over into my consciousness. I tried to sever the connection, but the codex refused. The neural link held firm, binding me to the god engine as it charged into battle. As Corpus Exultis clashed with the enemy machine, I fell to my knees, clutching my head. The voice was still there, whispering my name over and over, getting louder with each repetition. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. "Elisar," it said again. And this time, it wasn't alone. Other voices joined in, a chorus of anguish and fury that drowned out the sounds of battle. I didn't know how long I stayed like that, kneeling in the mud as the world burned around me. But when the voices finally subsided, I knew one thing for certain. Something was wrong with the binding. When I woke, my skull felt like it had been split open and sewn back together with steel wire. The pain was blinding at first, a sharp throbbing behind my eyes that refused to fade. It took me a moment to realize I wasn't on the battlefield anymore. The air was cleaner. I could hear the noise of machinery, the distant clatter of boots on metal flooring. A medical bay. My vision adjusted slowly. Pale lights illuminated the bare walls around me, the same drab steel grey as every other Imperium facility I'd ever known. A medtech hovered nearby, her back to me as she tapped at a console. She wore the standard uniform, white with gold trim, but her posture was hunched, her movements quick and mechanical. When I tried to sit up, she turned, startled, as though I'd risen from the dead. "You're awake," she said, her voice clipped and matter-of-fact. "That's Sooner than expected. How long? I croaked, my throat dry as sandpaper. 2 days, she replied, already busying herself with a syringe and a vial of something luminescent. You were in neural shock. Overexposure to the uplink. She glanced at me, frowning. You're lucky you didn't burn out completely. 2 days. I let the words sink in, my thoughts sluggish and disjointed. The battle on Nereth 6 felt like a fever dream, hazy, disjointed images of blood, fire, and that terrible voice. My name. They'd called my name. I could still hear it, like an echo trapped in the recesses of my mind. I clenched my fists, the rough fabric of the medical cot biting into my palms. What happened? I asked. The medtech hesitated, her eyes flicking to the console before meeting mine. The God engine sustained heavy damage during the engagement, she said carefully, but it performed admirably. The enemy construct was destroyed and our forces secured the objective. And the binding, I pressed, ignoring the pounding in my head. What about the souls? Her hesitation was answer enough. She didn't reply, instead injecting the contents of the syringe into my arm. A cold, tingling sensation spread through my veins, dulling the edge of the pain. You should rest, she said briskly, turning back to her console. The commander will want a full debrief once you're stable. The debrief came hours later, after they deemed me fit for duty. I was escorted to the command chamber, a windowless room dominated by a massive holodisplay showing a tactical map of Nerath 6. The commander stood at the far end, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from stone, every line and scar a testament to decades of war. His eyes flicked to me as I entered, cold and calculating. "Binder Istrin," he said, his tone curt. "I trust you're recovered?" "Functional," I replied, standing stiffly at attention. He nodded, gesturing for me to approach. The map flashed, shifting to display an image of Corpus Exultis in its dormant state. Even in stillness, the God engine was imposing, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the burning horizon of Nerath 6. "Your performance during the last engagement was exemplary," the commander said, though his tone carried no warmth. "The anomaly in the binding process was unexpected, but you maintained control of the engine when others would have faltered. For that, you have my commendation." His words rang hollow. They always did. The Imperium rewarded success with more responsibility, more burdens to bear. I forced myself to nod, my mind already drifting to the question that had been eating at me since I woke. "The voices," I said, cutting through his rehearsed praise. "During the binding, I heard them. They called my name." The commander's expression darkened, the faintest flicker of unease crossing his features before he buried it beneath his usual stoicism. "Anomalies of that nature are not unheard of," he said carefully. "The binding process is complex. The dead are often disoriented. They cling to fragments of memory, seeking something familiar to anchor themselves. It's nothing more than a byproduct of the procedure." "A byproduct?" I repeated, my voice rising despite myself. "It wasn't random. They knew me. That's enough, Binder Istrin." His tone was sharp, final. "You've been assigned to the Bone Engine for years. Perhaps the souls have learned to recognize you. It changes nothing. You will continue to serve." "Serve? Always serve." I bit back the retort burning on my tongue. He stared at me for a long moment, as if daring me to question him further before turning back to the map. "You're dismissed," he said curtly. "Prepare for the next engagement. Your skills will be required soon." That night, the medical bay had discharged me back to the barracks, but the noise of machinery and the muted snores of other soldiers did nothing to quiet my thoughts. "Elissa, why?" I sat up sharply, my pulse racing. The room was dark, lit only by the blue glow of status lights embedded in the walls. I scanned the barracks, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the corners. But there was nothing, just the others, asleep or too exhausted to care. "You let us die." The voice was softer now, almost pleading. It wasn't just any voice, it was familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. I activated the neural uplink on my forearm, accessing the Codex's logs. The interface displayed a list of the recently bound. Dozens of names scrolled across the screen, each one a life I had taken and offered to the God Engine. I hesitated before selecting the most recent entry. Her face appeared on the screen, the woman from the battlefield. Sharp features, dark hair matted with blood. Her name was Lian Vasran, and the moment I saw it, the voices surged, crashing over me like a tidal wave. I staggered to my feet, clutching the edge of the cot for balance. My vision clouded, and I thought I saw her, standing at the edge of the barracks, her eyes wide and filled with something between sorrow and rage. I blinked and she was gone. I didn't know her, I couldn't have. But her name, her face, they tugged at something buried deep within me, a memory I couldn't quite reach. The voices didn't stop. They got louder, angrier, overlapping until they became a chorus of voices all screaming the same thing. "You know us! You let us die!" I stumbled out of the barracks, desperate for air, for silence. The corridors of the stronghold were empty at this hour. I pressed my hands to my ears as if that could block out the voices. But they were inside me, scraping at my sanity. Somehow my feet carried me to the God Engine. Corpus Exultis stood in the maintenance bay, its massive frame still and lifeless. But even in dormancy, it seemed alive. The sound of its core a lasting imprint of the souls bound within. "You did this to us!" I froze. The voice wasn't in my head this time. It came from the God Engine itself. I stared up at it, my breath caught in my throat. The void where its face should have been seemed to shift, the runes around it glowing softly. "You took our lives," it said, the voices of countless souls blending into one. "And now, you will join us." The ground beneath me shifted and I fell to my knees. The voices swirled into a single agonizing scream, dragging me into darkness. The darkness didn't last. When I came to, I was lying on the uneven floor of the maintenance bay. My head throbbed, but the voices were gone, or at least subdued, lurking at the edge of my consciousness like predators waiting to pounce. Corpus Exultis stood above me, silent and still. Its face no longer glowed, its runes dim and inert. Whatever had happened, it had retreated, leaving me in a state that was neither relief nor clarity. The commander's orders reached me through a distant comlink, sharp and insistent, pulling me back into the war machine that was the Imperium. By dawn, I stood at the heart of the forward operating base. The battlefield stretched out before me, chaotic and endless, a mirror of the storm brewing in my mind. The binding ritual waited, unavoidable and all-encompassing, another step in the grind of duty. The voices had promised I would join them. Now they lay dormant, waiting for the moment when they would rise again. The sun, hidden behind Nereth 6's permanent shroud of smoke, cast the battlefield in a dim, rust-colored haze. We were in a forward operating base carved out of stone and reinforced with prefabricated steel plates, its walls barely holding against the pounding artillery from the enemy's lines. Soldiers hurried past me in grim silence, their faces obscured by helmets and visors that couldn't mask the weight of inevitability hanging over all of us. The bodies were brought in by the dozens, carried on stretchers or dragged unceremoniously through the mud. They were stacked in rows like cordwood, their faces frozen in various expressions of defiance, despair, and disbelief. Some were ours, their armor marked with the Imperium's sigil, a radiant sunburst etched into steel. Others wore the rough, asymmetrical designs of the enemy. In death, they looked the same, equal. I stood in the center of the staging area, the Spiritus Codex strapped to my arm. Around me, a team of junior binders prepared the equipment, glowing pylons that formed the ritual's perimeter, neural amplifiers to extend my reach, and a towering conduit that would funnel the harvested energy directly into Corpus Exultis. "Binder Istrin," the commander barked, his voice cutting through the din like a blade. He strode toward me, his broad shoulders clad in dust-caked armor. "The enemy is massing for a counter-offensive. We've received reports of multiple heretic constructs en route. If we don't hold this position, the entire campaign collapses. The bone engine must be ready." I nodded. "I'll complete the binding." I said, my voice flat. It wasn't reassurance, it was a fact. Failure wasn't an option. Good. The commander's gaze lingered on me for a moment. Then he turned and marched off, barking orders at the soldiers scrambling to reinforce the defenses. I turned back to the dead. The codex chimed softly, signaling readiness, and I knelt beside the first body. It was a young man, his chest crushed inward by some kind of blunt impact. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted as though he'd died mid-breath. Placing the codex's needle against his sternum, I began the chant. Your sacrifice fuels the Imperium. Your soul ascends with the God Engine. Eternal honor awaits you. The needle hissed as it pierced flesh, drawing forth a faint shimmering glow. The young man's essence flowed into the codex, swirling like liquid light before vanishing into its core. I moved to the next body, and the next, my hands steady even as my mind churned. Each binding was a ritual, precise and thoughtful, but today it felt mechanical. The dead deserved more than this. The first wave of the enemy attack hit before I'd finished the first row. Artillery shells exploded against the base's outer walls, shaking the ground and showering us with rubble. Soldiers scrambled to their positions, shouting orders and returning fire with plasma rifles and mounted railguns. Through the chaos, I kept working, my focus narrowing to the bodies in front of me. I couldn't afford to stop. If the God Engine wasn't ready when the heretic constructs arrived, we'd all be dead. The binding process accelerated as the junior binders joined in, their codices glowing faintly as they worked on the outer rows. The energy from the collected souls surged through the pylons, crackling like a storm trapped in a cage. My neural uplink burned against my spine, the connection getting more intense. The God Engine was stirring, its presence pressing against my mind like a tide rising too fast. Halfway through the mass binding, I felt the first rupture. It wasn't physical, at least not in the conventional sense. It was a psychic disturbance, a ripple in the collective resonance of the bound souls. One moment the energy flowed smoothly into the conduit. The next it bucked and twisted, resisting the pull. My codex vibrated violently, its interface flashing with error codes. I clenched my teeth, pushing through the pain as the neural feedback sent searing jolts down my spine. "Binder Istrin!" one of the junior binders called out, panic lacing her voice. "The containment field is destabilizing." "Hold the perimeter," I commanded. "Redirect the overflow into the auxiliary pylons." The field stabilized, but the damage was already done. The souls were resisting. I felt their anger, their anguish, surging against the boundaries of the codex. They were no longer passive. They were fighting. The second wave of the attack hit harder. This time, the enemy's heretic constructs were in the vanguard, their spindly forms advancing through the haze like spectres. Plasma beams lanced across the battlefield, cutting through the Imperium's defenses and sending soldiers scattering. "Activate Corpus Exultis!" The commander's voice roared over the comms. "We need it online now!" The God Engine stirred at his command, its frame unfolding like a waking giant. I felt its presence slam into me through the neural link, a tidal wave of raw power and will. The souls I'd already bound screamed in unison, their agony traveling through my mind. The rupture spread, the codex overheating in my hands as the energy spiraled out of control. A single voice emerged again, clear and piercing, cutting through the noise like a blade. "Why, Elisar?" The voice belonged to her, Lian Vasran, the name I hadn't been able to shake since the last binding. Her face flashed in my mind, sharp and accusing, her dark eyes burning with fury. My hands faltered, the codex nearly slipping from my grip. The battlefield around me faded, the sounds of gunfire and explosions muffled as her voice filled my mind. "You let us die," she said, her tone seething with pain. "You promised us honor, ascension, but this isn't salvation, it's torment." I didn't... The words caught in my throat. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, the codex sparking as it overloaded. The junior binders rushed to my side, their faces pale with fear. "The conduit is collapsing," one of them cried. "We need to stabilize it, or the entire field will—" A deafening roar cut him off as Corpus Exultis fully activated. The god engine advanced forward, its massive limbs crashing through the base's outer wall and into the battlefield beyond. I felt its rage through the link, a searing, all-consuming fire that burned away the edges of my consciousness. It wasn't just a machine anymore, it was a living thing, a monstrous amalgamation of bound souls and raw power. And it wanted more. The remaining bodies in the staging area began to rise, their forms glowing as the god engine pulled their essences directly into itself. The pylons shattered under the strain, arcs of energy leaping between them like lightning. The junior binders screamed, fleeing as the conduit collapsed in a shower of sparks. I tried to disconnect, to sever the link, but the codex wouldn't respond. I was trapped, bound as tightly as the souls inside the engine. Through the haze of pain and chaos, I saw the heretic constructs advancing. They opened fire on Corpus Exultis, their weapons tearing through its outer plating. But the god engine didn't falter. It moved with terrifying purpose, its massive limbs sweeping through the battlefield and crushing everything in its path. The bound souls screamed, their agony resonating through me like 1,000 knives. "Elisar," Lian's voice whispered again, softer this time. "You don't have to do this. You can end it." "End it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "How?" Her answer was drowned out by a massive explosion, as one of the heretic constructs detonated, taking half the base with it. The shockwave knocked me off my feet as rubble fell from above. When I looked up, Corpus Exultis was standing over me, its face staring down like a judge passing sentence. "We are incomplete without you. The pain will not stop until you take your place." The words weren't a demand, not exactly. They were an inevitability, spoken with the weight of something ancient and inexorable. My legs felt heavy, my body sluggish as I staggered back, trying to escape the pull of its presence. I dropped to my knees, clutching the codex against my chest, like a talisman that could somehow shield me. "The pain will not stop." I gritted my teeth, shaking my head against the onslaught. "No," I whispered, "I won't." But the words dissolved, torn apart by the surge of agony that followed. My neural link flared with blinding intensity, the interface sparking as the codex's systems failed to contain the energy rushing through it. My mind cracked open, and in that moment I felt them, all of them. The bound souls, hundreds, thousands, a storm of anguish, guilt and rage pressed against me from all sides, each fragment of consciousness demanding to be heard. "You took us. You let us die. You promised us honor. There is no honor here, only pain." I fell forward, my hands sinking into the blood-soaked mud. My body was mine, but my mind was already slipping. Memories surged into me. Not mine, but theirs. Each fragment struck like a hammer. I felt their torment, as if it were my own, and it was more than I could bear. "Stop!" I screamed, though the sound barely reached my ears. My voice was small, insignificant against the tide of suffering that bore down on me. "Please, just stop!" I raised my head slowly, as the god engine's form expanded, filling the space around me. I knew, in that moment, what it was offering. Not a choice, a fate. I stumbled to my feet, swaying as I looked up at the monolith before me. The battlefield raged around us, soldiers shouting, weapons firing, constructs colliding in bursts of light and smoke, but it all felt distant, unimportant. My world had narrowed to this one moment, this one decision. "I won't do it," I said. "You can't force me." The god engine's chorus didn't rise in anger or defiance. It didn't need to. Its response was quiet, almost mournful. "You already have." I didn't understand at first. Then I felt it. The bond. It was already there, a thread of connection so deep and pervasive that it was no longer a question of if I would join them. I already had. The bindings I'd performed, the lives I'd taken, the souls I'd harvested. They were all pieces of the same puzzle, and I was the final fragment. I had been feeding the engine my whole life, and now it was simply taking what was already its. The realization broke something in me. I thought I would scream, that I would fight, but there was nothing left. The voices weren't separate anymore. They were me, and I was them. The melding wasn't a moment. It wasn't even a process. It was an unraveling. My consciousness pulled apart thread by thread and rewoven into the God Engine's core. I felt myself stretch and distort, my thoughts splitting and scattering like shards of glass. Each fragment of me found its place among the others, slotted into the great agonized machine that was Corpus Exultis. And yet, I remained. Not whole, but present. I was both myself and something more. I saw the battlefield through the engine's eyes, vast and sprawling, a living creation of chaos and destruction. I felt the tremors of every explosion, the pulse of every weapon fired, the fading light of every life extinguished. It was beautiful, in a way I couldn't have imagined before. Terrible and beautiful. The pain was constant, a thrumming ache that underscored every thought. It wasn't just mine, it was everyone's. The bound souls didn't lose their individuality, not entirely. Their memories, their emotions, their suffering, all of it remained, woven into the collective consciousness. I could feel them pressing against me, their presence suffocating and yet strangely intimate. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" they said. "To serve? To obey? Well, now you'll serve forever." The battlefield changed, the enemy forces advancing rapidly. I could feel their presence now too. Corpus Exultis moved to meet them, its massive limbs tearing through steel and flesh alike. I didn't control it. I wasn't the pilot, I was a cog in the machine, a single voice in a chorus that drove its movements. We crushed the enemy. The Imperium's forces charged ahead, emboldened by the God Engine's fury. Victory was inevitable and meaningless. When the battle ended, the silence returned. I felt the soldiers below, their awe and fear radiating upward like heat. To them, Corpus Exultis was a savior, a divine manifestation of the Imperium's will. They didn't know what it really was. They didn't know what it had cost. A lone figure approached the God Engine's base, their form small and hesitant. A new binder. I could see their neural uplink, the codex strapped to their arm, their expression equal parts reverent and terrified. They didn't look up as they activated the binding protocols, their voice shaking as they recited the chant. "Your sacrifice fuels the Imperium. Your soul ascends with the God Engine. Eternal honor awaits you." I wanted to scream, to warn them, to tell them the truth, but the Engine's will was stronger. My voice joined the chorus, speaking through the neural link with a calm I didn't feel. "Proceed, Binder. We are ready." As the binding began, the pain surged again, a fresh wave crashing over me. I felt the new souls join us, their terror and confusion creating a storm in my mind. I wanted to resist, to hold on to something of myself, but it was already slipping away. In the end, all I had left was the truth, the one thing I hadn't let myself see until it was too late. Faith doesn't demand sacrifices, it consumes them. And now it had consumed me.